Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. I also teach in Toronto, Canada, and mostly online these days. My guest is Penelope Easton, an Alexander Technique teacher in County Clare, Ireland. And she originally studied zoology at Cambridge, then trained as an Alexander teacher. And then she encountered an Alexander teacher named Margaret Goldie, who was one of Alexander's early proteges, I guess you could say, and studied with her for 4 years, which set her off on a lengthy journey to understand what was so different about Miss Goldie, as she's known, Miss Goldie's teaching. And she's also written a book largely based on that, I believe, called The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement. And information on that's available on her website, which we'll put a link to next to the interview. This is part 2 of our ongoing discussion of you and Miss Goldie. And we're going to today answer the question, which your question is, why was Miss Goldie so angry? Welcome again, Penelope.
Hello, Robert. Yeah.
And why was she so angry?
Well, yes. I mean, everybody who went to her, or occasionally people said, oh, I didn't encounter her temper, but most people did. And it's like I've heard a lot of people say, why was she so angry? Was she just an angry person? And when I was first looking to write the book, I actually thought I'd write it more about her. And I interviewed a lot of her pupils, teachers, and also some pupils. And they'd all encountered her, or most of them had encountered her anger. And what I began to see was she was angry that she didn't feel that the mainstream Alexander world of that had come down through the main training schools was actually true to what Alexander was doing. Now, that's a big statement. And I'm going to say straight off, if it wasn't for Mr. MacDonald, Mr. Carrington, and Dr. Barlow and Marjorie Barlow, we wouldn't all be here today. You know, we needed that mainstream school to give us a more structured process that could be taught, could be handed down, or the technique would not have survived. So let's just say that straight off. I'm not looking to offend anybody here, but something got lost in that process. Now, have you read Lily Westfeld's account?
I certainly have, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating account. And do you remember the bit where she describes that in their third year, the first couple of years, Alexander was asking them to work on themselves. He gave them use of the self, he gave them their books and said, do what I did. And tried to get them, you know, they were doing hands on back of chair, they were doing wall work, they were going up on their toes, they were working on themselves. But at a certain point, and it was in the third year, MacDonald said, we're not being taught how to teach. We're not learning how to take people's heads forward and up. And he's not going to tell us, because what Lily Westfeld pointed out was when people asked Alexander questions, he dodged them. He wouldn't answer. And they felt he wasn't teaching them how to teach. And so MacDonald formed a little group that Lily doesn't name them. And it was Erica Whitaker who named them. John Hunter interviewed her. And she said, yes, it happened. And she said it was MacDonald was the one who said it. And he was joined by Lily Westfeld herself, Marjorie Barlow, and Kitty Merrick, who became Kitty Willapolska. And the four of them apparently worked together. And I also found it in one of Marjorie Barlow's books as well. She confirmed it, that that's indeed what happened. And they, between them, worked together and worked out what has become the training course method. And they worked out, I think MacDonald, for instance, was the one who said, what's this free the neck thing? And decided it meant that freeing of the atlanto-occipital joint. And yes and no, it's not the whole story, it turns out. But that's a starting point. So neck free meant that, and head forward and up meant, and they put together the training course method that um, then they could teach on a training course. It was repeatable. The students could do it, and it's worked, as it were. I mean, here we are. I don't know how many generations have gone past now. We must be into the fourth generation at this
At
point.
least, yeah, yeah,
I lose track.
yeah.
Um, and that method is reproducible, and that did the technique a favor. I think when you have a founder, founders don't have a technique. Founders have a discovery process. And that's what I was describing in our previous podcast. That when one comes to quiet and then lets the body respond, you make a discovery. But there isn't a technique to that. And what then happens, and I think it's happened in more or less every method that's out there, that some of the followers then have to turn it into a technique which is reproducible. And what Goldie pointed out was that it turned it on its head, because she said, in that the head neck back comes out of the stopping.
Hmm.
When you make this stop and your body then moves, you discover that your neck frees, your head goes forwards and up, your back lengthens and widens. The discovery is made, and you make it anew every time, and it's a discovery process. Whereas she said the mainstream schooling has turned that on its head, and we're taught how to let the head go forward and up, back lengthen and widen, and so on, as the method by which we then move. So it's a technique rather than a discovery process. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I guess my question would be, why would it not have been possible to teach what Margaret Goldie taught you as part of a training course?
And I think that is itself a very, very good question. Um, and I suspect the answer was that nobody really understood what they were doing at that point. Um,
Mm.
I think, again, if you read the accounts of all those early trainees, Peggy Williams or MacDonald or Barlow, or all of them, they all struggled to understand what was happening. Um, Alexander did a phenomenal job, really, to try and understand what he'd discovered and put it into words. And he got halfway there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole load of stuff that didn't get articulated. And what I've done is to take that the next phase. I think I was lucky in that when I went to Goldie, I was already doing Bates work. I was already very aware of the eyes. So I was aware, for instance, that when she brought me to quiet, the whole room would just come present. And I would come present to the whole room and myself and the specifics of what I was looking at. She usually had tulips on the windowsill.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be looking at the tulips and I'd be seeing there was a sort of basement space behind, sort of one of those courtyards between buildings behind, and I can still see that whole scene in my mind. And if you ask anyone who went to her, they can tell you, they can still remember all the details in her room. The two shelves with the books on them, and the packet of oatcakes, and the Paddington bear, and the desk with the clock, and the old table. Everything was, it all came present, and you came present, and time slowed down. Now, what on earth is happening there?
Yeah.
It's different, and I don't think anyone could put it into words enough to reproduce it. And that's what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've identified are the factors that were involved in that, and that's what I did when I launched the Goldie workshops. There's this thing that she taught me, coming to the mind in the brain, bringing the mind to the brain. Do you know, nobody else she worked with ever heard that, and yet it's such an important
Right.
concept.
Well, I know that I've been teaching for quite a quite a while now, and whenever I get a student who has had lessons with another teacher, uh, I ask, one of the first questions I ask is, well, what do you do when you notice that you're not functioning as well as you'd like to? Something like that. What's your strategy for dealing with that? And what I've discovered is virtually no one has a strategy other than booking another lesson with an Alexander teacher, except for people who study with Marge Barstow, who have all kinds of useful strategies. But most students of most teachers don't really have any. I'll ask them, for example, well, does the term Alexander direction mean anything to you? Many of them will say no. Some of them will say, oh, yes, my teacher used to use that. That was something she used or he used. But it is not something for me to use. And in fact, my first Alexander teacher, who just worked with his hands exclusively. He didn't say anything much. His English wasn't very good. I once asked him about directions, and he said, "Oh no, that's for really advanced students, not for you." And I thought, well, and I didn't know any better, and I figured maybe that was correct. And one thing Marjorie Barstow did when I first encountered her was I realized, yep, they're usable right now and are very practical, and you can make changes in yourself quite easily if you understand them. But that does seem to be have been missing, and I guess still is missing from a lot of Alexander training.
And I'm sure not everybody would say that. I'm sure there are
Oh,
people
I'm
who,
sure people would argue, would say I'm
yes,
completely wrong. Yes, and people
well,
have said
no,
that. Yeah,
yes, yes, it's not that you're wrong. I think it's that people do come out with different experiences, even out of the same school.
sure.
So, some people did come out. I mean, there was a woman on our course, for instance, who knew she was going to go back and be the first teacher in Iceland.
Hmm.
And I can remember as a first term trainee going up to her and saying, will you work on me? No, she said, I won't at the moment. I'm working on myself. Now, how she found out to work on herself, I have no idea. But, the first term she came back after having a term back in Iceland, she was a mess.
Hmm.
And we sort of all put her back together again. The second term she came back, she wasn't a mess. I
Hmm.
was like, okay, so what did she discover? I don't know. And I've no idea whether she went to somebody else to get what she got, because I never saw Misha give it to her. but
Right.
but somehow she knew she had to discover it. Whereas I think for most teachers in London, you just didn't have to. You
Right.
know,
Well, and of course,
and
Marjorie
got
Barstow left after 3 years of the training course. She qualified after 3 years and then went to study with Alexander's brother, who actually was his assistant in the States for several years. And then she was in Lincoln, Nebraska, in the middle of nowhere for many, many years. And as she said to me, there never a day went by when I didn't explore what I learned from Mr. Alexander. I mean, it was consuming for her apart from the rest of her life. And eventually she came up with a way of teaching because people asked her to do workshops, and there's a whole history there. But she was really developing her ideas largely on her own after leaving England. There were no other teachers anywhere near her.
yeah.
Like
So she had to.
yeah,
Yeah.
she had to.
Yeah. And
Um,
Erica Whitaker, I think, had a similar experience because, when they all finished the first training course, most of them, stayed around or built practices or whatever. Erica
mhm,
went off traveling. I think she was straight into Papua New Guinea or somewhere remote.
right,
And
right.
she told me that the others were writing to her saying, what a pity you're not using your technique, Erica. And she said to me, I didn't know what they were talking about. Of course I was using it. I was using it every time I did the washing up and every time I you laid the table or whatever. She said I was using it all the time. But you know what? There's a thread here, and it goes back to the small school. I think. Do you know about the link back to Irene Tasker here?
No, I don't. The small school was this
Yeah,
project of having a school for young children, somewhat, maybe largely based on Alexander principles, right?
yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't know. What's the link to?
Right. Okay. So Irene Tasker, she was a very bright woman who took her first lessons, I think, in 1913, even or 1917, I forget, but very early on.
Hmm.
And then she also trained in Montessori. And so she persuaded Alexander to set up the small school where
Hmm.
she was using Montessori methods, but working with the children. And right from the start, Alexander had been throwing children at her more or less and say, work with this child before she'd hardly had any lessons. And
Hmm.
so she was having to work out right from the beginning how to help that child improve their use. And she at that point had no knowledge of how to put hands. So she was working in application, directing the child on how to use themselves better with no knowledge of how to use her hands. And then when she started the small school, I think by then they were putting hands on the children, but the emphasis was on how you use yourself in relationship to your reading or writing or whatever you were doing.
Hmm.
And Goldie, the school started to expand, and Goldie took her first lessons in 1927, and then went away and taught in a mainstream school because she was also a teacher. And
Hmm.
then when they wanted to expand the school in 1928, Alexander wrote to her and said, will you come back and be a second teacher at the school? And of course, she did it like a shot. And so again, she was working in application with the children in the school and teaching them how to keep their length and how to keep from being reactive in their school lessons. And both Marjorie Barlow and Erica Whittaker, as young women, in the year before they were allowed onto the training course, they were put to work in the small school as apprentices. And they both served a year of apprenticeship with Irene Tasker. Now, when the first training course happened, um, Goldie and Irene Tasker were both effectively trained, but they would both come into the school as often as they could to discover how to work on adults because they'd never worked on adults. And Irene Tasker took to doing at homes in the evening, I think one day a week, where they would all Alexander's trainees would go to Irene's home and they'd all cook dinner together and they'd work in application. And
Hmm.
Marge Bosco was among those. And I heard
Oh,
it said that she realized in later years she got a lot from Irene Tasker and those at homes.
interesting. Because
Isn't it?
that was one of the things that really distinguished Marjorie Barstow from most, not all, but most of the teachers I'd met in London. Marge was very application oriented. It was even a bigger difference between her and the other teachers than the fact that she was working with groups, which was also quite a difference. And I remember in the late 70s and early 80s, one of the directors of our school was Paul Collins, who was a runner, Canadian guy who was a runner, distance runner. And he started working with runners using the Alexander technique, an early kind of application approach in England. Um, it was quite novel actually, and somewhat controversial.
Mm,
And because a lot of teachers, if you were a musician and you showed up for a lesson, the last thing the teacher would work with you on was playing music, which the idea being, well, we work with you on other things and it gets carried over. But a lot of times it doesn't get carried over. And yeah, so Paul was an early advocate of application work, and he was fascinated when I told him about Marge Barstow, but he had to kind of keep a low profile on that for various
yeah.
political and other reasons.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah,
remember when I was first training, there were the huge arguments going on about group work and application
group
work.
work was a major issue.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in
and
the late
application work
70s.
as well. But the interesting thing about those at homes, the one person who didn't go was
Mm-hmm.
Patrick MacDonald.
Uh-huh.
And, I wonder if that's, I mean, I don't know, but I wonder if that's because he was a, white middle class male, as it were, and had no interest in cooking, or whether he just wasn't interested in broadening it out. I don't know. But he didn't go. And so he never got that side of it. And then Carrington, of course, wasn't in that first training
Right.
course.
Right.
Barlow was, and she apparently, I've read in one of her books, her um, niece, I
Exam.
think, or daughter, I forget, says one day a week they would do an application day. So she
Hmm.
carried that on, but MacDonald, it just wasn't present. And then Carrington joined in the second training course,
Hmm.
and then they expanded and they needed the space for the training school. And that's when the school moved to Penn Hill. And so Goldie and Tasker at that point were gone. Erica
Hmm.
Whittaker had gone traveling. Marge
Hmm.
Barstow went back to America.
Hmm.
And, the people who knew that application work were gone. So Carrington never
Oh,
got it.
yeah,
And,
and
and at
certainly,
that point,
yeah, right. There wasn't much there, and I had a number of lessons with Patrick McDonald, and it was they were very standard, in and out of a chair kind of things. There was no application
no.
work
And
that
you
I
see,
could.
I'd define that still further. I'd say that he only defined the technique in relationship to your own body,
Hmm.
which, which is rather how Alexander writes in his book. He
Hmm.
doesn't write about you being in relationship to your tasks of life, particularly. Um, he talks about it in, your parts of the body in relationship to each other, but he doesn't talk about that in relationship to life. Now, if you're going to do application work, and I learned this particularly from Erica Whittaker, who talked about it more explicitly, we have to be in relationship to our world. And the only person who defines that is Frank Pierce Jones in his book, where he actually says that in order to get past his faulty sensory perception, in order to be able to let himself get out of the chair without doing the old thing, he has to come into this expanded spatial relationship. So this is a whole other topic
Right.
that
Right.
we could.
Well,
Um,
I think we should um, do part three in a moment, which would be a little bit about how Alexander worked on himself and what his initial influence, the influences on him was, and how that influenced his early teaching. What do you think? We just move to that for
oh,
part
right.
three.
Okay. So you're moving to that. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
just because it's in the same line.
Yes. The
So
history
if
thing
that's
first.
okay with you,
Right. Let's stay with history. Yes.
we'll bring this conversation to a close, but stay
Come back.
tuned. There's
Right.
another one coming up. So my guest today has been Penelope Easton, an Alexander teacher in County Clare, Ireland. And I'll put a link to her website by the interview. And in part three coming up, we're going to talk about how Alexander came to discover the Alexander technique, you might say. So Penelope, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.